Morning, everybody, and welcome back to Asia Sustainability Week, presented by Economist Impact. This is our second day of the event. We've got 4 days this week, 2 virtual and 2 days in person. So it's fantastic to see you back in the room for our second day of in-person discussions. Yesterday, we covered a lot of ground. We had a look at sustainable finance. We talked about carbon markets, supply chains, and the circular economy. Today, we're not short of more topics to run through. We're going to begin the day with the discussion of regulation and policy. We'll also touch on PPPs, ESG reporting, climate risk, biodiversity, and look at the role of women in sustainability as well. So many great discussions to come for the rest of the day. We've got a lot of partners we've been working with for this event, which is a real testament to the importance of sustainability in Asia and the higher intensity with which corporates are considering this as a critical issue to address. So I would like to thank our sponsors and partners for the event. Happily, there's many of them. Clean Edge Asia, IBM, Johnson Controls, the Minderoo Foundation, Rambol, Capitaland, DocuSign, KPMG, Musim Mas, Sime Darby, Plantation, South Pole, Vupico. We had a networking lunch yesterday, thanks to Invest Hong Kong, and we're working with the UN Global Compact as our global sustainability partner. You'll see some stalls and information from some of our partners out in the lobby, so go chat to them and find out what they're doing and get more information about their activities. Now we're going to start today with a session on regulation and policy. And I'm going to ask my panelists to come join me on stage. We've got a mix of private and public sector participants to talk about what's happening, what's the impact, and what needs to happen, what's not good enough, and what do both governments and policymakers have to do. We have Kim See Lim, who's the Regional Director for East Asia Pacific at the International Finance Corporation. We have Sungrot Rasinyopash, who's the President of SCG, joining us from Bangkok. Jorge Laguna Silis, the Director of the One Planet Network at the UN Environment Programme. And Olivier Tichit, who's the Director of Sustainability at Musim Mas. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so today I want to start our discussion with a bit of a stock take for the region. I mean, when we look at the Asia Pacific in terms of sustainability, I mean, we can think about climate in a narrow sense, but then actually I think the same applies to sustainability in general. Asia is really the critical region because, of course, Europe and the US historically are bigger polluters and have had more historical environmental damage, but policy there is much more advanced. And, you know, we can look at, say, policy settings somewhere like the EU. I mean, by and large, they're roughly at what is needed to get to net zero by 2050, right? The EU is kind of on the trajectory, more or less, whereas Asia is absolutely not. And here, a lot of the environmental impact of the region is still rising rapidly. Some of that is about moving up the income scale and development, and of course that's natural and we'd expect it. But Asia's also got a lot of big middle-income economies and a lot of wealthy economies too, many of which still kind of, you know, don't step up to the plate in the way that countries with similar income levels in different parts of the world do. And so policy settings here, I think, have got a long way to go. And with the population of the region and the growth that we expect to see, it's going to have a huge, huge impact. And so what happens in Asia, I think, really drives what happens for the world, for sustainability in all sorts of areas. And so it's really critical that the policy settings and the regulatory settings are right. So let's, Kim See, can I start with you from the IFC perspective? I mean, this transition to sustainability that Asia needs to do, it's large. It will take a lot of investment. A lot of new capital stock will be required, and we'll need the private sector as well as the public sector to be putting a lot of capital allocation. And because these assets are usually long-lived, think how long does the power station last, and these sorts of things. We need to start early. What's the current state of the financial regulation in the region for attracting sustainable finance? Are we on a path to get there?
Yeah, no, thanks, Simon. I think you hit the nail on the head in your opening remarks, right? That this region is the region where we can actually make a difference. And I always say, the climate battle will be won or lost here in Asia.
Right.
And you also rightly pointed out that regulation in other parts of the world, which are less polluting, are a little bit more advanced. And I think in this region, we have quite a lot of work to do in terms of standardizing standards. For instance, I've lost count of how many green bond and standards there are. I think the number is more than 300. Right. So I think starting to standardize these standards would be helpful. Also, I think when you look at the amount of capital that is needed, that amount is north of $20 trillion per year in order to get us to the sustainability goals that we have set. Mm-hmm. And when you look around the world, the capital is there. I mean, we're talking trillions, but when you look at the amount of AUM by pension funds, sovereign funds, endowments and so on, that number is north of $200 trillion. So the capital is there, but why isn't the capital coming? And as you said, because when you allocate capital to long-term assets that are needed to move the needle on sustainability, you need to provide investors the comfort that their investments will be protected and that they actually can measure the returns of the asset class that they believe they're investing in. Mm-hmm. So hence, clear regulation, standardized standards for measuring and reporting are important, and I think the region has some work to do in that regard.
What do you think the most critical changes in regulation that are required to get the capital allocation right?
Firstly, I think it's defining the asset classes, right? What is a green bond? What is a blue bond? How do you measure carbon impact? I mean, what is the carbon price? Mm-hmm. The various measures of the value of 1 ton of carbon today. And I think once we can have some harmonization around some of these metrics, you're going to see that capital coming in. Mm-hmm. Because there's always a lot of capital chasing the good assets. Mm-hmm. And good assets are assets that one can truly understand what you're investing in. Mm-hmm. And until you have standardized standards, it's hard to figure out what you're investing in.
Right, so harmonizing standards across borders would be a useful activity. Yeah. Olivier, can I bring you in on this question about policy, because you're working in the palm oil sector in Indonesia, and we have a slight good news story here in the sense that deforestation in that industry has decreased a lot over recent years, so that's a lot of movement in the right direction for that sector. How much has that been driven by government action, I guess regulation and policy, as opposed to, say, customer or stakeholder pressure for change?
Thanks. First, I would like to slightly rephrase that. I would say deforestation has decreased. Not only deforestation for palm, but deforestation has decreased. Why do I say that slightly differently? Because by the time palm oil has deforestation in it, it's a couple of years after the deforestation has taken place.
Right.
So what's most important and what we can see now is that deforestation in itself has decreased for palm, for pulp, for anything. And that's pretty good news. Yes. How is it influenced by the governments? Yes, the governments of Indonesia, Malaysia in particular, have been very voluntary there. I think they realized not only the impact on their environment, but the impact on the global environment. And so you've seen some really harsh, for our industry, decisions on having a moratorium on licenses for industrial plantations, and having some pretty stiff changes in how you could not expand on primary forest and peat areas, even though they might not have been gazetted earlier as protected areas. So it was a bit, I'm not going to say brutal, but a rapid change in how our industry could expand. And that has had a massive impact. At the same time, it was a good combination of, at the same time, the industry coming to terms also with the fact that it has an impact and it has to change. And it was not only a matter, I think it was a matter of not only the consumer good manufacturers pushing for that, but also the producers realizing that palm oil is a perennial crop. So once you plant palms, you have them for 25 years. Mm-hmm. We are thinking in pretty long cycles. So we had to look at those longer cycles and think how much longer do we want to be under pressure, and how do we consider that our industry has to remain relevant, and how do we make sure that what is planted today will remain positive or will have a positive impact tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So I think it was a good combination. The timing was reasonably right. Is it working perfectly? No, there's peaks and troughs in the good results. I think there's sometimes a bit of a disconnect between government and industry. And of course, there's a big problem, which is how do we reach the 3 or 4 million smallholders in Indonesia just for palm? How do we make it so that they're also connected to these changes and not disconnected from them, or even worse, excluded from change?
You mentioned that for the palm oil industry in Indonesia, the pace of regulatory change was quite severe. The change was quite fast. Was that something that was expected by the industry, or did it come as were they not thinking the government would act?
I think that's a good question. I think some actors were definitely not expecting it. I think nobody was expecting what came out. I think the pace of change was faster than what was expected. And so it made for some pretty difficult adjustments. Mm-hmm. An area that would have been legally plantable today, suddenly tomorrow was no longer plantable. So it changed, and that's a problem for the industry in as much that some investment plans were changed, some development plans were changed. So it was not always welcomed. And it was found that it was maybe a bit too brutal. At the end of the day, if we look at the shape of the industry today, we're still a thriving industry, an industry that benefits greatly, at least Indonesia. It's one of the first export items of Indonesia, palm oil and its products. Mm-hmm. It has lifted literally millions out of poverty. We can definitely say that, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, for that matter as well. And so it's a good industry. We're still in a position where we can participate positively to the future. Plenty of work left to be done, but and the hardest part maybe comes now, but right. Plenty of work yet to be done, yes.
And just finally, I just want to dive into, why do you think that policy change happened? Was it just change of thinking at the government level? Was it some effective lobbying by environmental interests? Was it public opinion? What caused the government to change so fast?
So keeping in mind, I'm not a political analyst at all. Two things, I think, came at the same time. You have longer-term thinking by the government on how do you manage Indonesia, basically. How should the land be managed? And so what are the areas that can be developed or should be developed, and which are the ones that should not be developed? And also, I think 2015, the big fires of 2015, and the impact on the region, I think it was something that the government of Indonesia took very seriously and decided, enough. We cannot be seen as the cause of regional pollution. That is not something that's not the role of Indonesia. That's not the place of Indonesia. So you had these two concurring things. So one more urgent reaction, and something that was maybe more long-term thinking of how do you zone, how do you plan the future of the environment in Indonesia.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's pivot back to the public sector, and Jorge, and bring you in. So you're at the UN Environment Programme. So, I mean, you're obviously following policy around the region and then also globally. What's your take on on how close Asia is towards the stringency required, and whether the pace of change is fast enough?
Thank you very much, Simon, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. I would just add a point to what you introduced, that our main role is to focus on regulation and focus on policy. That's absolutely true. But the area and the program that I represent, that's the One Planet Network, it's very much of a solutions-oriented network that's working at 3 levels. The policy level, through the national focal points and the ministries that are driving the circular economy agenda. The entrepreneurial level, those innovators that are helping to create those solutions to, one, redesign the products that are required. And I've been so pleased to hear wonderful stories here of the people and companies that I have met that are rethinking their products, extending the products, and also keeping their resources for longer. And finally, the stakeholders and the societies that we serve. Going back to your question, the way we see it at the United Nations Environment Programme, and building on what my friend here, Olivier, mentioned, we are seeing a coming of age of Asia-Pacific region as a whole. The strides that have been achieved in terms of developmental gains in the last 20 years are now reflected by very strong policy ambitions. We can quote last year the action that was taken and the leadership from Indonesia in the G20 agenda, which was critical and central to driving not only the resource efficiency, but also the adaptation towards climate and addressing the huge need to build resiliency and strengthen the core of the economies in the Asia-Pacific. We're seeing it now with India playing a pivotal role in the G20, and also with this wonderful country, Singapore, that's hosting us. China has set the agenda as well on preserving nature, thanks to the Kunming-Montreal protocol that was just agreed on biodiversity. So we are seeing in the last years that despite a very fragile global scenario, governments are stepping up in this region. The challenge that we are seeing is that regulation is not driving entrepreneurs in the right direction. Asia-Pacific, it's still a region that is heavily dependent on subsidies that are providing incentives to, for example, not extremely heavy carbon projects. And despite that, we're seeing high levels of pollution. We're hearing wonderful stories and inspiring stories on how the rate of deforestation has been abated. Then what role can regulation play here? What we see it is that regulation has a central role to play, and it's often the decision of leadership that's enlightened and that understands the role that their countries played in the global stage, of entrepreneurs that are helping drive that agenda through both voluntary but also through that race to the top of companies that are innovating and creating solutions, and then the whole of society approach that is required to bring change, and also not forgetting the central need that inclusion has in our economies.
So it's what do you think is then the top priority for governments in Asia, where you think they need to be prioritizing new action?
I would say, and as I was thinking what would be the key message that I would leave here, the 2 top priorities that governments have now, it's very simple. The first one, it is to ensure that they invest resources in creating the economies of tomorrow, that they invest resources in driving innovation, and that innovation helps achieve 2 goals: a smarter consumption patterns, because we need to provide better standards of living for the societies in Asia as a whole, but reducing the overall footprint that we are putting on the environment. And achieving that balance, it is an extremely critical one. Second, the region has to adapt to the climate and nature emergency that we are living. The risks, financial, fiduciary, and also in terms of infrastructure that are there that will come out of a changing environment have to be taken into account, future-proofing our economies and future-proofing our businesses.
Mm-hmm. Let's switch back to the private sector, and Sungdok, bring you in. So you're president at SCG, so Bangkok-based company, but global in operations and working in the industrial sectors primarily, so chemicals, cement, and related. I know SCG has its own goals for reducing emissions and for net zero and for sustainability. Can you tell us how, again, similar to Olivia, how much are those driven by policy settings and how much are they driven by stakeholder pressure?
Well, I think for us, as a company, I mean, we are in cement, chemicals, and packaging, which are the sectors that are actually hard to abate. But for us, the root of our company is from sustainability. When our company was founded more than 100 years ago, the product was cement only, and that was made so that Thailand can be developed. So all along, we have paid a lot of attention to sustainability, making sure that we don't harm the environment and so on. But when this topic is come in, I think we're looking back at ourselves. That's when we made the commitment that although we are part of the problems in terms of the emission, but we hope as well to be the pioneer, at least as a part of the solution. Because I think a lot of our products are commodity products. But it means that commodity products is that the products that are essential to everyday life. Packaging is a good case of example. Cement is the same. Although you don't build houses every day, but I think at the end of the day you still want to go back to live in houses or condominium and so on. Chemicals the same way. So we have decided to put the path forward. And the path forward is, for example, becoming net zero in 2050, cutting down the emissions by 20% in 2030, and that's based on the absolute volumes, absolute values. Not much, frankly speaking, was driven by the regulations. But I guess now what we are seeing that a lot of countries, in Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on that we are operating in, there are a lot of regulations come in, and a lot more are in the plan to come in. The question is that, whether these regulations, first of all, is going to result in a better environment, not environment from the industry standpoint, but environment for each country or not. I guess that's the thing. That's why you're asking whether that's driven by the regulations. I'm sure the path forwards that we are taking is going to be shaped a lot by the regulations, not only in Asia, but in other countries that we are doing business with. And we do hope that at this time, in terms of the regulations, formulations of the policy and so on, that the private sectors would be allowed to involve. Otherwise, you end up with the situation where countries is getting a lot of tax, but the industry over the long run cannot survive. And as you know, environments has no boundary. So we might not end up what we are like to see. I think that's the issues that's why a lot of industries, a lot of companies are coming forward and saying that, well, although we are part of the problems, but we also like to be a part of solution as well.
Becoming part of the solution leads us on quite nicely to the topic of public-private partnerships and the role that they are playing or could play in the transition to sustainability in the region. Kim Si, at the IFC, you're very involved in PPPs. Yeah. Do you think they have a bigger role to play?
Yes, absolutely. I think PPPs have a very, very important role to play for several reasons. As I mentioned, the capital is there, right? How do we bring the capital in? And PPPs is a very neat way of doing that to entice private capital, but also from the government perspective. Pre-pandemic, the governments already had a pretty tight fiscal space and was spending something like 4 to 5% on average of GDP just to meet the infrastructure sustainability needs. That's clearly insufficient, right? And during the pandemic, many governments had to spend a lot of fiscal space on social support, pandemic recovery type initiatives, and that has depleted the fiscal space available, or what would have been available to help with the sustainability agenda. So the problem is even more acute now when you look at it from the balance sheets of the government. And hence PPP is a very neat way, one, to help government increase revenue, because if you privatize an airport, you will get some revenue streams into the government that can then be deployed for other social needs or maybe for the climate action. And it also brings in the private sector to run these assets more efficiently most of the time. And also it helps the governments through the asset recycling program to monetize some of these assets that may be less efficient or could be improved from a sustainability angle. So I think it's win-win-win in all respects. And at the IFC, this is exactly what we're doing. We're helping governments both on the mitigation and on the adaptation side. For instance, in Fiji, we're working with the government of Fiji to identify affordable and sustainable housing opportunities. So one is identifying a site that is less exposed to climate risks, and then constructing homes that are climate resilient, as well as energy efficient. That's one example, right? We're also working with governments around the region and around the world on energy transition, so helping them with the solar IPP and structuring of the power purchase agreements to make them internationally bankable, to provide that confidence to investors to come in to invest in solar assets that are comparable across the world. So back to my point earlier, and I think my fellow panelists also alluded to it, carbon doesn't know boundaries. It doesn't stay within boundaries. So we need regulation that is consistent across the region and consistent across the world in order to make a difference.
Right. Yeah, so the environment is a global problem. I mean, some elements more local than others. Of course, I mean, for example, Olivier talked about the effect of haze, which is a very local problem in like reducing deforestation in Indonesia. I mean, climate change, in a sense, is the very opposite end of the spectrum. So, okay, CO2 goes into the atmosphere and affects everybody equally. And then we've also talked about the difference in the level of current policy settings between, I guess, especially Europe and APAC, but I mean, all regions are essentially in a different place. I mean, one international policy that's just coming on stream now to try and address that is the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? So the EU for a long time has, by and large, had the world's most stringent carbon price. It's been an emissions trading scheme rather than a tax. But it's had the most stringent policy settings, and that has meant that emissions-intensive industries are higher cost in Europe than elsewhere. There was a period of free permit allocation that was gradually phased out, and European firms now basically facing the marginal cost of their pollution, and they're worried about just polluting industries moving elsewhere. And the result of the EU's carbon policies might be no change in global pollution, but just the industry moves out of Europe. So hence this carbon border tax, where they're looking to tax imports into Europe from countries that don't have as stringent policies. So let's talk about cement, or your kind of sector. So cement is one of the industries covered. So now when your company is exporting material into the EU, you're going to be facing a tax at the EU border. Do you think that's a useful policy for driving change, and has it affected your business decisions?
Well, I think when you look at the products, you have to take a difference between what products are global, what products are local, what products are regional.
Yeah.
Cement is very local in nature because you don't ship cement across the continent. Okay, you do cement production and you serve the local market.
Transport
So I
costs.
would say that in terms of the carbon tax adjustment and so on, probably have no direct impact to cement. It will probably have more impact to industry like chemicals or to some certain extent to the packaging, because the products can go to anywhere in the world. And then when the products go to anywhere in the world, then you'll be subject to taxation in any of the consumption markets and so on. So I guess when the government or when the regional government, like EU or ASEAN or governments in Asia, thinking about the carbon tax adjustments and even the ETS and so on, they also have to recognize that there are differences among the products and among the industry as well.
Right.
So that's one thing that they have to keep in mind. Secondly, I think, does that mean that for some certain products there will be fragmentations or there will be walls crossing each countries? I guess not. Like I mentioned, pollutions or environments have no boundary. What happened in one will have the impact to the rest of the world ultimately. So I think when the policy makers get together to decide, they have to keep that in mind. That protectionism or regionalized regulations and so on is going to help to some certain extent, but then they have to have the coordinated policies that allows industry that are willing to make an investment to abate, to make the transitions, can at least survive and hopefully making the reinvestment. That would be my argument.
Right. Olivier, yeah.
Yes, maybe, well, palm oil will be eventually touched by this as well, and palm oil is a very global commodity because of all the products that we have downstream. So I'll make everybody happy. I'll blame the EU for a second. Point is, the EU is looking at the right problem, which is that there is a discrepancy, there's an asymmetry between what are the requests, what are the standards in the EU, and what are the standards in other parts of the world. But it's answering it, in my opinion, in the wrong way, in a very defensive manner, in a very protective manner. If we look at the regulation and other regulations coming up, so the deforestation due diligence regulation, for example, they are defensive regulations, and they are, unfortunately, even communicated as being defensive regulations, or protectionist regulations. And I think that's a real shame, because as you said, the EU has made a lot of progress. It has very interesting regulations. And instead of showing the way, it's closing its doors. It's saying, I will not have high carbon or products produced with a lower carbon tax in my market, which is not maybe the wrong measure, but it's brought in the absolutely wrong way. And there was an article this morning in the Business Times in Singapore by the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank, who was asking a typical question, which is, and what are they going to do with all that tax money that they're collecting? It's going to stay in the EU, and likewise with the deforestation regulation that's coming up, it's stopping things from entering the EU, it's making this barrier, it's making the EU market absolutely clean and perfect, and it's missing the point that, as Rungrot has said, the environment has no borders, and we need to look at a global solution. So the EU is missing the opportunity of leading the way, and instead it's protecting its internal market. I think that's a big disappointment, to be honest. For me as a European, I feel disappointed. I see the impact on my industry. The upcoming regulation will effectively exclude smallholders if it is not modified, if the implementation is not rethought carefully. And it's a real shame, because it was showing great promise. It was going in the right direction, but it's very EU-centric and not global.
But the EU would say, well, look, we've had a carbon tax since 2006 or something, And the fact is, no one's really followed. And so, the time for leading by example, we've tried that. Fair go. We've incurred a lot of cost. We've done that for a decade. No one else has done it. Actually, we hope that now if Thailand introduces a carbon tax, we won't apply the CBAM. So ideally, the revenue raised is zero.
Yeah, that's what the chief economist of the EDB was saying. He was saying, look, there's an opportunity there for Asia. And I would agree if it is, and I think, Kim, that's what you were saying earlier, if it is harmonized. And to me, that's also, again, being a European, I look at ASEAN in particular, where I've been for almost 25 years now, and I'm seeing the opportunity, again, to build a common market and to do something that is valuable to the economies of the region, and that puts them in a completely different position than to think about environmental impacts and how to decarbonize the economies of the region.
We've got a few minutes left, so I'm going to give the chance for any audience questions. If you want to put your hand up. First hand was here, and there's actually many, many hands, so maybe I'll pre-warn the organizers I might run over a little bit and see what we can get through.
Thank you very much. Matthew Baird, Director of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law. I have a question for Kim Si Lim. The IFC has been really a regional leader in ESG reporting and gender participation for women in senior positions, especially on boards. And really, I want to ask you that question about sustainability. The Asia-Pacific area has a problem of gender participation, women's participation on boards and senior management, and I'm wondering how important is that to achieve sustainability objectives in Asia to ensure that women are represented on boards and in senior management, especially in large companies represented here today?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, and I think a very pertinent question as well, with regards to sustainability and the do-good objectives that we have. Having equal participation, and not just gender, but there's a difference between equity and equality. I think equity is very important in all respects. It's the underrepresented groups, it's the minorities, it's gender, it's everything, right? So I would extend it a little bit broader than just gender. And at the IFC, this is critical for us. And it's a key corporate objective, so we do have KPIs, we do have programs where we work with our clients to increase gender participation, to increase participation of underrepresented groups in all of the business lines that we do.
And we're going to have actually the last session today will be focusing on that topic. So stay tuned for more. Question down the back down there, and then I'll come to the front.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Tania from Indonesia. So my question is for Mr. Oliver. Yeah, it's so interesting to hear your sharing about the regulation in Indonesia. My question is, what's your key success in making sure the regulation does not put the business at risk? And is there a way actually to communicate with the government about the impact to your business? Thank you.
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. Yes, you always. So in Indonesia, in particular in our industry, we have various industry groups which are consulted by the government more or less, I think. I would like to make a very quick point on governments in Indonesia, maybe. There's two different things. There's the policy level, which is very important. That's the central government level. But to us, what is very important also is the local level. And I would say, if for people who are not familiar with Indonesia, 3 levels of government: central government, regional, provincial governments, and district governments, let's say. And we find it that, as far as we're concerned, to ensure the best outcomes, we have to work both at the national level, but most important, and that's something we did after working with the IFC for a few years on smallholders training, on how we engage with the local governments, because they are the ones delivering at the end of the day. They are the ones doing the first mile enforcement. They are the ones doing also they have the immediate interface with small farmers in our case. And we found that both are equally important. I hope I will, when I go back to Indonesia, the central government will not be offended. But I find them both to be very important. And what I would like to say here is that often the district governments are seen as too focused on their own matters and not looking at the big picture. There's been a big change in the past couple of years. We have what we call smallholder hubs, where we work with local governments on training smallholders, and we see the interest from the local governments, various ones. They even come to us and say, we want to do this as well. Why? Because they want to deliver a better service, and they want to be able to demonstrate a good impact also on the environment. And working with smallholders is something they find quite critical.
Sungro, do you want to add?
Yeah, I was listening to what Oliver was saying. The other issue, which I think we have not mentioned much, is about the awareness and communication to the public. I mean, consumers and public. You look at consumers in Europe, to some certain extent in Japan, US, and so on. There are large segments of consumers that care about sustainability. In Asia, I cannot answer for our other countries in Asia, but in Thailand, people care about, tomorrow am I going to have a job or not? Tomorrow, how do I pay for my rent? Tomorrow, how am I going to be able to feed my family? That is not going to help the sustainability movement. At the end of the day, what is going to be able to sustain require both supplies and demand to work harmoniously. And, I'm not in politics, but, Thailand is going to have the next election in the next few months. What is missing is the policies regarding sustainability. And probably that's not the fault of the political parties. But because no one cares, they address what the people cares. So unless there are some effective communications and creating awareness or debates or dialogues so that people do care, otherwise there's not going to be any effective policies coming out of it. And then when people care, there will be transparencies. There will be justice, or there will be equality in terms of the how do you address what is going to be impacted, what is going to be gained from this trend that we are going into the net zero.
Yeah, I mean, that is a challenge for the region, getting public opinion more aligned. All right, and final, one last question. I promised down the front over here, and then I'm being forced to wrap up. I've got a big red sign flashing up at me. So you can try and squeeze your questions into other panels or grab our panelists during the break.
Well, thank you. My name is Nishit Srivastava. Thanks for the interesting insights. So overall, the panel mentioned about the subsidy-driven Asia Pacific, and overall GDP spend anyways paves way for the development programs that government outlines. So, I mean, we cannot differentiate the transition-based regulation with a socially aligned development that we can have, including biodiversity and balanced ecosystem. So my question for the panel is that how do you see regulation being driven from a just transition point of view, and how do you strike the right balance between the whole net zero aligned climate agenda versus the needs of people and everyone involved in that side of things?
Okay. Jorge, do you have any international perspectives about the just transition?
Yes, and thank you very much for bringing that perspective. I think it's very important from what we're hearing here in the panel that we address and understand the importance of inequalities as a whole in the region. There has been tremendous progress. Inequalities, though, have to be an important component to be addressed in a just transition agenda. But nevertheless, there are opportunities. There is a very important approach, for example, in the case of India, that is shepherding the vision of a life movement, lifestyles for the environment. Why? Because it is understood that countries such as India can leapfrog and show the way by embracing, as a matter of fact, an approach that's socially just, but also providing better opportunities for citizens. We also have heard, and I would just leave it here with my last two messages in case we're wrapping up this panel. Regulation, and let's assume that regulation is going to remain very much inconsistent across different regions. That standards, although we would like to see them harmonized, are going to be very much conflictive. Therefore, what is the opportunity there? Invest in data. The more you know your product, the more you disclose the product, the more you disclose information about the products you're producing, the greater it will be, because sustainability is not a green and black. There are so many shades. Look at the bottom line. What is the just transition meaning, for example, for a company that produces different products, palm oil, cement, and so on? Embracing new business models that make products more affordable, but with less environmental impact. And that, I think, it's a key component in which many companies here have to play. So indeed, very important message, and India is leading the way with this important agenda in the context of the G20.
Thanks, Jorge. Well, unfortunately, yeah, time to wrap up. But please do go and ambush my panelists during the coffee breaks. I'm sure they'll love to get more questions from you. But yeah, please join me in thanking Kimsey, Rungod, Jorge, and Olivier for a really great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Great.
Thank you.
Anna, who will be sharing with us on SDG progress to 2030. After our photo, okay.